Greetings and welcome to this essay explanation video. In this video we're going to be looking at this question, pulling it apart, working out what kind of arguments that you should be using, looking at a sample structure, talking about what will gain you marks and also what mistakes might sadly cost you marks. So today's question is, evaluate the extent to which small parties have an impact on UK politics today. This video should be watched in conjunction with your own individual feedback, but it's this video that will kind of give you the meat and the meat that you can all the information that you'll really need to answer this question. So let's pull apart this question first of all. Evaluate the extent to which small parties, plural. You need to be talking about a multiple range of parties here. The Lib Dems, UKIP, Brexit Party, Change UK, or the Tiggers, whatever they're calling themselves this week. SNP, if I haven't mentioned them. Maybe the nationalist parties in Ireland, Sinn Féin, DUP. Maybe a little bit of Plaid Cymru, the Greens, etc., etc. The examiner's not going to be expecting you to mention every single small party in the UK, but if you just write this essay on one or two, your breadth is going to be too narrow. Secondly, the extent to which small parties have an impact. Now that's one of those nice phrases which is deliberately vague. Now the main way you might want to talk about this having an impact is electoral success. To what extent do they win seats or win power? Think Coalition 2010. But have an impact is a far bigger phrase than just electoral success. It could also be input fear into the main parties. It could be adjust the policies of the main parties. It could be to what extent do they have they got their way in some way, but have an impact needs to be a lot bigger than just electoral success if you want to be aiming for the higher marks. But of course, electoral success does need to be there. The last thing to point out here is that the question does say evaluate the extent to which implies that it's looking for you not necessarily to go fully one side or the other, but the examiners this year, just gone in 2019, are looking for you to make a case that is more or less going one side or the other. And especially if you're looking for kind of a simple way of understanding these questions, do think, right, which way am I going to go? They either have a big impact or they don't have a big impact. That is your kind of starting point for this essay. So let's look at the arguments that we could be using here. Let's start off with the arguments that say, yeah, they have a serious impact. The first one is this: they impact policy. Now, they may never win power, but a party like UKIP and a party like the Brexit Party have effectively caused the UK to leave the European Union. Without winning a general election, the other parties looked over their shoulders, they saw what was coming, they saw that they were hemorrhaging votes, even MPs, to these smaller parties, because 2 or 3 Conservative MPs actually joined the Brexit Party, and they capitulated. David Cameron offered a referendum to leave the EU. He also did the same thing with the SNP. With the SNP was gaining huge amount of power in Scotland. He offered them a referendum on independence. They didn't get it, but they got very, very close. So we can make a very strong argument here to say that smaller parties can, in certain circumstances, impact the policies of the larger parties. You can also make an argument, for example, that many of the larger parties, Labour and Conservative, have kind of converged on the Lib Dems territory a bit, especially when you had the era of Tony Blair and David Cameron. They very much were pushing into a kind of socially liberal group. Again, you could argue that the Lib Dems had an impact there by drawing politics towards the centre. The second way they have an impact is that they win seats. Now, this is, of course, linked to impacting policy, but here we're actually talking about, are they taking chunks of parliament or are they taking chunks of the regional parliament? So the SNP won nearly all of Scotland in 2015. I think it was almost every seat except one or something like that. You know, it was incredibly high percentages. You've got the threat of UKIP, the threat of the Brexit Party. The Brexit Party, of course, winning the European elections in 2019, and you had UKIP winning the European elections in 2014. Check my date on that one. But we do have them winning huge amounts, the smaller parties winning huge amounts of seats, perhaps outside the UK general elections. Lib Dems always do very, very well in local elections, for example. So Watford, where I live, has had a Liberal Democrat mayor ever since I've lived there. So these parties do win seats. Now the question for you is well, does that mean they've had an impact? And that's where your analysis comes in. Now, let's look here. AO1, AO2, AO3. Now, AO1 is relatively straightforward. So I've been mentioning UKIP, I've been mentioning SNP. AO3 is relatively straightforward. You need to kind of pick a side and stick with it. But AO2 is this analysis, and it's this idea of logical chains of reasoning. And I like this phrase, chains, a lot. And when I was marking for the exam board, I was always looking for those students that kind of made a point and then kind of said, well, therefore this, and that links to this, and the impact of that is this, but on the other hand, this goes the other way, and on the other hand, this goes with this, and therefore this, and the whole thing was kind of going with this idea of one thing kind of linked to another, and it was the paragraphs kind of chained idea after idea after idea in a logical chain of reasoning. And you can do this with this win seats idea. You can kind of talk about, well, UKIP won so many seats in 2015 in the European elections, therefore the Conservatives were scared about what they might do in a general election, and they saw that they might be leaving power, therefore they adjusted their own policy. So this can be seen that the UKIP had a huge impact on yada yada yada, but on the other hand, they never actually won any power or entered a coalition. Do you see what I'm doing there? I'm chaining these kind of things together and showing a wider political knowledge and wider understanding. They also can hold the balance of power. Think 2017 with the DUP. This only kind of really happens when the bigger parties are very, very, very close. And when they're very, very close in terms of their seats, then the smaller party, either in a coalition, such as in 2010, or in a supply and demand agreement, with the DUP, they can be the ones that are effectively the kingmakers, and they can have a huge impact here. So the DUP got £1 billion for Northern Ireland by agreeing to prop up the Conservative government from the magic money tree that they said never existed. The Lib Dems got their impact was to get huge amounts of reforms and an AV referendum as well by offering to go into the coalition with the Conservatives. And I've already mentioned the role of the SNP. So the balance of power, they can, in a sense, kind of crown the king by giving those last few little votes to get them across the line. The last way they can have an impact is in the House of Lords, or perhaps in the regional parliaments. If you look outside of Westminster, smaller parties actually have a far bigger representation in the House of Lords, in the regional government. So you can look at the impact there as well. Now, the killer arguments here, I think, are going to be that the impact on policy and the win seats, maybe the left. The last one's certainly the kind of the weakest argument and the one you can kind of knock down. But it is good to include that House of Lords thing if you can, because it shows a wider understanding of where smaller parties do have that impact. But I'd certainly be looking on the left-hand side if you're looking to make this case. So what about on the other side, saying they do not have an impact? How are we going to do that? Let's look at one argument at a time, if I can make it hopefully come up that way. So the first thing to look at is the idea that we live in a two-party system. They don't have an impact because at the end of the day, Conservatives, Labour, Conservatives, Labour, Conservatives, Labour, we have had only two parties with prime ministers ever since 1945. Yes, we have a coalition in 2010. Yes, we have a supply and demand agreement in 2017. But the prime minister has always been from Labour or Conservative since 1945. And even before that, you could still argue it was a two-party system. So we could make an argument that says no matter what they do, at the end of the day, they're never going to win power. They're never actually going to make a significant impact in electoral success. We can also look in particular at 2017, which is the most recent general election as of the 9th of September. Then we might have had another one by then, because smaller parties had grown and grown and grown consistently, probably since the kind of the mid-80s until the kind of 2015. You have the return of the Lib Democrats at various points. You have the rise of UKIP. You have the huge rise of the SNP at various points, and all of these parties, these smaller parties, are going up and up and up until you hit 2017, where the UKIP vote completely collapses, probably as a result of winning the Brexit referendum, mission complete. The Lib Dems have been wiped out from an unpopular coalition, and I think over 85%, check my figures, end up back in Labour and Conservative, back to the big two. And it's good in your essays to show over time. You could kind of say, well, the third parties, rather than just saying, yes, they have an impact or no, they don't have an impact, you can kind of say, well, actually, small parties actually had a pretty big impact from 2010 to 2015, but in 2017, their impact is not nearly as strongly felt anymore. That would be a beautiful paragraph that shows an understanding of third parties over a long period of time there. Of course, you might then have to caveat with that by saying Brexit Party 2019 are breathing down the Conservatives' neck yet again, and perhaps Boris Johnson wouldn't have been elected Conservative leader if it hadn't have been for the success of the Brexit Party in the most recent European elections. Is that a killer argument? Oh, it just might be. Another thing linked to what I've been talking about here is that third parties are often temporary. Labour and Conservatives are pretty much a permanent feature of UK politics in a way like the Republicans and Democrats are in America. But the other parties come and go. Let's go back to the 80s. The SDP, remember them? They came and then they went. The Liberal Democrats, up in coalition in 2010, wiped out in 2015. UKIP almost winning the European elections, the early kind of 2010s, completely destroyed under Paul Nuttall in 2015 and 17. So they come and they go. The SNP perhaps has grown and grown. The Greens have never really kind of taken off in the UK, perhaps to the electoral system. But you can make this argument that they have a limited impact, or their impact is transient. You can kind of make that kind of case. The other thing that says that they don't have an impact is the systems that actually exist in Parliament. And I've already alluded to one, which is the electoral system. First past the post really hurts smaller parties because they rarely get across that post first. The obvious exception here being the SNP in Scotland. But look at the Lib Dems. They get millions of votes every time and they win tiny amounts of seats. The Green Party, millions of votes every time, tiny amounts of seats. The system kind of keeps them out. And look at the physical layout of Parliament. It's set out in a two-party system. Government on this side, official opposition on this side. We have the cabinet and we have the shadow cabinet. And the Lib Dems, they've only got instead of having the shadow chancellor, they just have the financial spokesman or the spokesman for education or things like that. Like the whole of Parliament is set up with this idea of two parties, and these other ones are trying to get a look in. They're not even allowed to sit on the front benches in the same way or stand by the dispatch box. They're often pushed out very much of select committees. You get a huge amount of Conservatives and Labours on there, and then maybe just one. The Lib Dems don't even get to ask a question every single week at Prime Minister's Questions because their numbers in Parliament are so small. Now, you can completely argue that this is fair for the seats that they've won, but the point is that the systems, the electoral systems, and the way that Parliament is run is not conducive and helpful to smaller parties. Whereas if you look at the electoral systems for the regional party in Scotland, where you've got a hybrid system, there's a proportional element, all of a sudden they do a lot better. When you look at the European elections, where you've got the closed party list, all of a sudden these proportional systems let the parties have a bigger impact. Let's keep using the word of the phrase. You could also perhaps compare smaller parties to pressure groups and actually kind of say, well, do they actually have as much impact as a pressure group like Greenpeace? Like what has more effect, the Green Party or Greenpeace? What has more effect, the protests recently on the Extinction Rebellion and all the marches that took place on global warming, or the Liberal Democrats Party, or the Let's Legalise Cannabis Party? You could also make an argument that says, well, is UKIP actually a single issue pressure group that has kind of grown into a kind of a political movement, and it's not really a political party, it's a pressure group? You could kind of go that way. Perhaps that's a little bit more kind of, it's an odder argument to bring in, but you could kind of say that actually if you really want to make an impact outside of the big two, you need to be a pressure group. Might be somewhere you can go. Again, I would say that these two are probably your killer arguments, although you could actually bring in the other ones to support it. So you could say that the electoral system of Parliament is what causes it to be a two-party system. For example, the temporary nature of some of the smaller parties is what caused 2017. There's no reason why you can't combine arguments using logical chains of reasoning, which gives you wonderful AO2 marks. So let's look at a sample structure, which would give you lots and lots of jubbly marks. The first thing you need to do, of course, is before you write an essay, you need to decide which way you are going. And for my sample structure, we're going to say parties have little impact. And in this introduction, we're basically going to say parties have little impact. And we're going to name some of the arguments that we do so. When I was marking over the summer for examining, there were so many students that started off their essays by defining things or giving me kind of explanations as to what kind of small parties are. And it's not answering the question. The question says, do they have an impact? And yes, telling me what a small party understanding what a small party is part of answering this question. But the question isn't asking you what a small party is. So you want to kind of show your understanding of what a small party is while making the argument. You don't need to kind of deal with it in its own sense. So just get straight into your argument. Just get straight into the direction that you are going. Tell me which way you're going, make the case, and then in the conclusion, tell me which way you've gone. There's your structure. So in this sample structure, I might start off by talking about how we are a two-party system. I'll use the examples I mentioned earlier about only two parties in power since 1945. I might then go to this idea that there was a rise in 2010 and before then, and it's over in 2017. And this whole DUP thing, it's only happened because Conservative and Labour are quite close. The DUP wouldn't have had an impact otherwise if it wasn't for what was going on with the major parties. You see, and the reason why that paragraph would work well is I've shown off knowledge. I've shown knowledge over time. I've been able to throw in lots of examples. I've perhaps shown a counter argument by saying, well, hang on a minute, there was a rise in 2010 in the coalition, and then I've knocked that down. So that makes me a good quality, lengthy paragraph. I'm then going to go into this parliamentary systems thing. I'm going to say, well, the electoral systems squash them out. I'm going to say this official opposition argument that I was talking about earlier. Then I might counter that and kind of say, well, hang on, the rise of the SNP, they broke through this electoral system idea to do really well. But what impact have they really had? They've never been part of a coalition. They've never had a supply agreement the way the DUP has. They lost their own referendum. You can knock this down if you work hard. You could also kind of say, well, look, all these people, we had this big hoo-ha of a lovely new party called the Independent Group, and it was gone 3 weeks later. Chuka Ramuna joined the Independent Group, resigned from the Independent Group, joined the Liberal Democrats. They changed their name. You could use the idea of the Independent Group to kind of show that launching a third party can do well. Remember, you need to be biased here. So if you want to show that new and smaller parties have a big impact, you're probably going to talk more about the Brexit Party. If you want to kind of mock them a little bit, you're going to be talking more about Change UK. Do you get the idea? You need to choose the examples that fit the argument that you're trying to make. Now, you've got to understand this. You need to write a biased essay, but your biased essay must include arguments from both sides. So arguments that say parties have little impact, arguments that say parties have a huge impact. They both need to be there. If you don't, you will not get above a band 2 or maybe a band 3 at an absolute maximum. But what you need to do is you need to choose your side and build up the arguments that support you, knock down the arguments that don't. So that is fine. That is fine. That's not good. That's not good. And that's not good. Okay, just think through in your head what I kind of mean by that. If all your arguments are on one side, you're not going to do well. I'm sorry, my green screen's gone a bit weird here. If all your arguments are on the other side, you're not going to do well. If you just balance it and say, look, there's arguments here and there's arguments there, you're going to ruin your AO3. You need arguments on both sides, build up some, knock down the other. Make sure your essay does that. So here I'm doing that. I'm bringing this argument about, saying, they do have a significant impact on policy, and I'm going to build that up, and I'm going to say, yeah, but look at what they've had on Brexit. But then I need to knock that down, don't I? So I can kind of say, well, UKIP's never had a big electoral success parliamentary, only ever had one seat. The Brexit Party's got no seats at all. We can say that, use that parliamentary thing. I can even go down another route and say, well, Brexit is a very, very unique issue. It's torn the Conservative Party apart. It's been very controversial within Labour. Brexit is something which it's not showing that small parties in general have a big impact. It's just that this particular issue is so controversial that it's breaking down the traditional system of parties, because it's not so much an economic issue as almost like a kind of a tradition one about kind of national unity and kind of nationalism. So you need to find a way to knock down the argument that your counter argument, a counter, if you like. And then I'm going to conclude, and I'm going to draw my arguments together and say, hey, parties have little impact. Now, I've got 3 paragraphs there, but in each case, I'm explaining the argument I've got, I'm building it up, I'm using examples, I'm then countering that argument, and then I'm either countering my counter or building it up. So each of these paragraphs is pretty darn long. So this is going to be a lengthy essay, even though there's 3 sections. If your paragraphs aren't going to be particularly long, then you need to put in a 4th paragraph. But hopefully I've kind of shown you here how you can get a lengthy, detailed chain of logical reasoning in your paragraphs to do well. So how are you going to make yourself stand out? How are you going to get that A star? How are you going to get that really kind of top grade? So here's a few things that could go wrong, or a few things that will make yourself stand out. The first thing is this word depends. It depends. It depends. The second thing is getting breadth, which I referred to earlier. So why do sometimes smaller parties have a bigger impact, and sometimes do they not have a bigger impact? Think about that. How could you get that into your essay? How could you get that high level of understanding of not just say they do or they don't, but saying, well, it depends on this. Maybe it depends on the state of the major parties. If the Conservatives are completely divided and chucking out Kenneth Clarke and chucking out Dominic Grieve and Amber Rudd's resigning, then they're a complete mess. And if Labour is divided and some of the MPs will support Jeremy Corbyn and is being challenged, then maybe these parties are in a mess. And that allows other parties to kind of come through the middle. You could look back to maybe a situation like maybe perhaps 2010, when you had Gordon Brown that wasn't particularly popular, David Cameron at that point wasn't particularly popular, and Nick Clegg kind of comes forward and takes that crown there. You have a situation in 2015 where the coalition isn't particularly popular. Austerity is really beginning to bite. Ed Miliband hasn't really come forth as a believable alternative, and then UKIP is kind of pushing up then as a result. Do you get the idea? You can talk about how the divided parties can maybe you could also go when Labour was unpopular in the 1980s, the SDP came through. So maybe it depends on the state of major parties. Maybe it depends on the policies of major parties. None of the major parties were saying we should leave the EU back in 2010. UKIP was. There was a gap in the policies of the major parties, and UKIP grabbed it. None of the major parties were talking about having Scottish independence. The SNP was. They grabbed it. If you wanted Scottish independence, you voted SNP. There was no alternative. So maybe the policies of the major parties makes a difference. Then, of course, when the Conservatives picked up the policy of Brexit, UKIP was no longer needed and they didn't pick up any votes. Make sense? So maybe the policies of the parties will affect whether small parties have success. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, maybe the electoral system. Compare the Scottish National Parliament, the Scottish National Parliament with the UK Parliament in terms of the success. Compare the local elections to others. You can say, well, it depends on the systems that you use will change the impact of the parties. There may well be other arguments you could bring in. To recap from before, you need to have a range of parties discussed. You need to be showing how parties have had different success over time. You need to be talking about impact in more than just electoral success. The opposite, of course, would narrow you down too much. So that's how you would make yourself stand out. It's actually a pretty nice essay, I think. If you've got a good understanding of British politics, if you've got a range of examples that you can bring in, and if you follow the ideas that I've shown you here about making a case using a logical chain of reasoning, this is a good essay in which you can get yourself to an A grade and really be confident that you've made a good quality essay. Let me know if you've got any questions. Stick them in the comment section or speak to me in class. If there's any other arguments you can think of and you want to bring in, or other good examples that you could bring in, stick them in the comment section on this YouTube video, and then maybe other students can kind of see it in the future as well. If I've made any mistakes, or you can fill in any of the little factoids that I missed out on, then do that as well. Give the video a like if you liked it, and I will see you soon. Take care.